Bien, muy buenas tardes y bienvenidos a Casa Árabe.
Good afternoon.
A esta
Welcome
conferencia,
to
cómo
Casa
sobrevive
Árabe.
Daesh militarmente.
Welcome to this conference on how does
Omar Ashour acaba
Daesh
de llegar
survive,
esta tarde de
militarily
viaje
speaking.
y nos complace también
Omar
mucho tener
Ashour
aquí
has only
a
just
Pedro
arrived,
Baños
and we
para
also have Pedro Baños with us this
llevar a cabo
afternoon,
un
so
análisis
that
más completo
he
y
can
un
give us a
debate
fuller,
que también
more detailed account
filosófico.
and a debate in which
Esta
we would like
mañana
you to participate as
leía
well. This
una
morning,
noticia en el
I
New
was
York
reading
Times.
an
Estados
article
Unidos se ha
on
comprometido a
in the
desplegar
New York
más
Times.
de
The United
200 soldados
States has
adicionales a
committed
Irak
itself to
en
deploy over
diferentes
200 additional
partes por
soldiers
primera vez en la
to
lucha
Iraq and
contra
to
el
introduce Apache
autodenominado Estado
helicopters to
Islámico,
fight against
Daesh.
the
Este es el primer
so-called
aumento importante
Islamic
de las
State,
fuerzas de Estados
Daesh,
Unidos
in Iraq.
en
This is the
casi
very
un año.
first increase
El
in the
aumento en las
forces of the
fuerzas de
United States
combate
over the last
estadounidenses
year. The
está
increase in
diseñado para
these
ayudar a las fuerzas
forces,
iraquíes a
American
retomar
forces,
las
is to
áreas de
help
Mosul y para
the
ayudar también a
Iraqi forces
Raqqa
to
en Siria, la
retake
también
Mosul
autoproclamada
and the
capital del
city
régimen islámico.
Raqqa, the
En
self-proclaimed
junio
capital
pasado, el
of the
gobierno de Barack
extremist group
Obama
in
anunció que
Syria.
cientos
In
de
June,
soldados
the
serían
Obama government
desplegados para ayudar a
announced
los
that hundreds of
iraquíes
soldiers would be
a retomar
deployed
Ramadi, un objetivo
to
que
help the
lograron al
Iraqis
final
to
de este
retake the
2015.
city of Ramadi, and this
También
was
los
achieved at
funcionarios
the end of
estadounidenses
2015.
dejaron
American
en condición de anonimato.
civil
El New York Times
servants
dijeron que
told the New York
habrá una
Times
serie de
anonymously
fuerzas
that there would
especiales
be some
en
special
Siria que se
operational
incrementarían
forces in
en
Syria,
algunos
which would also
soldados,
be increased
que todavía el secretario de
in the near
Defensa
future. The
no
Secretary of
lo
Defense has
confirmó.
not really
En
confirmed
cualquier
this,
caso,
however. In any case,
las
the
cifras y
figures
estadísticas
and
en
the
torno
statistics
a las capacidades
on
militares
the
de Daesh
military
no son exactas.
capacity of
Varias
Daesh is not very
estimaciones
precise. There are several
inicialmente pensaban
estimates.
o calculaban
It was
que
thought
eran entre unos
that
9.000
there were
y
some
18.000
9,000 to
combatientes. Más
18,000
adelante, en el
combatants, but
2014,
then in
esta
2014
estimación se
this figure
incrementó.
was
La
increased.
CIA la
The
evaluaba en torno a
CIA
los
calculated that
20.000,
there would be some
entre
20,000
20.000 y
or
30.000
possibly
combatientes entre
31,000,
Irak y Siria. Pero las
500,000
estimaciones son mucho
soldiers
más
in
altas,
Iraq
por
and
lo que el
Syria, but there are
Observatorio para los
more
Derechos Humanos
estimates which are much
estimó
higher.
que Daesh
The
tendría más de
Observatory
50.000
for Human
combatientes
Rights
tan
of
solo
Syria
en
would
Siria.
say that there would be over 50,000
Rusia, el jefe del Estado
combatants
Mayor
in
ruso,
Syria alone,
tendría unos
and the Russian
60.000 hombres de
general
varias
of
nacionalidades. Y
the
el experto en
headquarters
seguridad con sede en Bagdad,
mentioned the
Omar Ashour,
possibility
dijo
of there
que
being some
podrían estar
70,000
cerca
men,
de
armed
los
men.
100.000.
And it was also said
Entonces,
that there would
hay
be
una gran
some
variación en la estimación
100,000
de
soldiers,
las
according
fuerzas
to Hisham
militares
al-Hashimi,
en el terreno
a
de
security
Daesh.
expert in
Y es posible que no
Baghdad.
tengamos
So there might be a very
datos
large
que
number
permitan
of
distinguir
combatants, and we have no
calcular con
way
precisión
of possibly
esta
calculating
presencia
whether
militar.
this is
En
correct
cualquier
or
caso, el
incorrect.
ascenso
In any
de
case,
Daesh
the fact that Daesh is
como organización
becoming
terrorista
stronger as a jihadist
internacional no deja de
organization
sorprender
is really
a
rather
los
surprising.
analistas.
Even
El
the
grado de
most
brutalidad, sus
eloquent
sofisticados métodos de
analysts
captación de
are quite
reclutas,
surprised at this. Their capacity
su
to recruit
propaganda
people, their
sumamente
propaganda
ofensiva
methods, which is
y
generally
sofisticada,
very
su capacidad de
offensive and
mutación también en el
sophisticated in the
terreno,
way
forma
that they
parte
are
de su
capable
estrategia
of
de
shifting on the
desinformación.
ground, clearly
Sin
shows that
embargo,
they are very
a pesar de
diverse
estas
in
estimaciones
their
que
actions.
comenté,
Despite
está
all
claro
of this,
que
it is also clear
militarmente
that militarily
no
speaking,
representan o
they
no
don't really
representarían una amenaza para una coalición
represent a
como la
threat
que se ha formado con batidos o con los
to
ejércitos
the coalitions that have been
de
formed, or they
Estados
wouldn't
Unidos
really be a threat to
y de Siria.
the forces fighting
Entonces,
in Iraq and in
¿cómo logra
Syria.
sobrevivir?
So how does it survive?
¿Qué es lo que hace
What does it
Daesh
do? What
para
does
poder
Daesh do
seguir
to be
enfrentándose
capable
a la
of
ofensiva de la coalición
fighting
y
against
seguir
the
tomando
coalition
la sartén por el
forces,
mango?
and how can it
Para ello tenemos
continue
aquí hoy a Omar Ashour,
ruling
catedrático de
this
Estudios de Seguridad
particular
de la Universidad de
game?
Exeter.
Now we have several experts
Actualmente
here.
es investigador
The
asociado en
Omar
Chatham House,
Ashour,
Instituto Real de Asuntos
works on security issues at the University of Exeter, and he also works in Chatham House and worked at the Brookings Institute. He wrote the book, The De-Radicalization of Jihadists, Transforming Armed Islamist Movements. He's a co-author as well of an Economic and Social Committee of the United Nations for Western Asia on security issues during transition phases, and he's also published other works, armed conflicts, Islamist movements, relationship between civil and military power, strategic studies, and terrorism. He wrote his thesis in Canada at the McGill University and also at the American University in El Cairo. Now we have Pedro Baños Bajo with us as well, who works in the armed forces. He has been a member of the armed forces in Madrid, and he has also worked in the area of security of the European Army in Strasbourg, and he was also at the Strategic Security Division of the General Secretariat of Defense Policies. He has degrees at the Complutense University in Madrid on the subjects of defense and security, and he also participated in 3 missions in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And I'd like to give the floor to Omar Ashour. He'll be speaking some 20 minutes, and then Pedro Baños will make some comments, and then we would like to start a debate on this question. Omar, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Karim, for the kind introduction. Pleasured and honored to be here with you. I'm going to speak a little bit about how IS militarily survived the last 2 years against all the odds. But just by way of background, Karim mentioned de-radicalization, which is a kind of a fancy term that I authored a book about, and I meant specifically the transition from armed to unarmed activism. And I was looking mainly at North Africa, but also at some examples in Europe and Latin America. And one of the conclusions that I arrived in that research was that unless you have the right political environment, meaning an environment with a thorough security sector reform process, balanced civil-military relations, non-violent conflict resolution mechanism, this idea of de-radicalization will be a myth. The transition will not happen in that case. And in 2011, when the Arab majority uprisings, or the Arab Springs between quotation, started, I thought that we are on the track of a transition period, and some of these de-radicalizations and transitions from armed to unarmed will actually become real. Of course, Gaddafi and Bashar al-Assad both kind of decimated that thought and showed that civil resistance has very limited capacity to make major changes, and somehow the war in Libya and then the other war in Syria more or less stopped that pattern of transition. So I went back to my initial research, which was insurgency and counterinsurgency, and here I am once again talking about these issues. So for a second, as Mr. Al Pacino said in Godfather 3, just when I thought I was out, I was pulled back in again once again. So here I am trying to explain why IS militarily endured. And it's quite significant in a sense that this is an organization in most of its battles is outnumbered and outgunned, either by state actors or by non-state actors. The rivals are many, as you know, ranging from Al-Qaeda in Syria, like Jabhat al-Nusra, where we have like some intense battles now in the Yarmouk refugee camp south of Damascus, all the way to state actors, whether regimes or international coalitions. We have, if you want to put it in comparative perspective, the Taliban regime in Afghanistan collapsed in about 2 months, or lost control, let's say, not collapsed, lost control of its de facto capital in Kandahar in about 2 months after the coalition airstrikes started, and with the help of the Northern Alliance, which was a coalition of decentralized militias helping the coalition. That's in Afghanistan. In Iraq, if you want to do a comparison with the Ba'ath regime, the Saddam Hussein regime, it lost control of its de jure capital in less than a month and a half, also against the coalition airstrikes and with a ground invasion by the US, led by the US and the UK. In comparison, the Islamic State has been in control of both its capitals, the Iraqi one in Mosul and the Syria one in Raqqa, after about 18 months of significant bombardment. And many sometimes challenge the term significant. Well, the numbers really don't lie. Anthony Bilkin said that the deputy Secretary of State in the US mentioned that there was about 8,600 strikes in about 15 months throughout 2015. This translates in 20 strikes per day, 62 bombs per day on IS targets. And it had some damage done. We're talking about estimates range from 20 to 25,000 deaths among IS alleged fighters, and significant destruction of some of their resources, limited capacity to fight in a conventional way using armored artillery, more and more reliance on guerrilla tactics and urban terrorism tactics. So it had some consequences in that sense. But the fight is not over, as we all know. We also had, the Obama administration, President Obama, coming out and saying that they lost about 40% of their territory in Iraq. This did not prove to be very accurate. It is much less. Independent analysts put it together between Iraq and Syria at about 14% losses throughout 2015 in terms of territory, in terms of controlling territory, about 14% losses, but also expansion in some areas, including areas like northeast Sinai in Egypt, but also areas in central Libya where Sirte, one of the major cities in the center, the birthplace of Colonel Gaddafi, was also taken in 2015, and an expansion about 100 kilometers east of, about 150 kilometers east of Sirte in Bin Jawad, which is close to Benghazi, and on the other end, west of Sirte, about 100 kilometers in the Haisha areas. So you have some expansion as well in other areas, and then nominal control and allegiances in places like East Nangarhar in Afghanistan, northeast of Nigeria as well. So more or less alliances here and there in a very decentralized fashion, if you wish. But also the puzzle continues in a sense that if you looked at the specific battles, how did they fight? You will always find that they should not have won, to put it very simply. In a place like Mosul, you had one attacking IS fighter against 25 soldiers and officers in Mosul. And one attacking, the soldiers, the 25 were defending. In the case of Ramadi, you had, which was retaken from them recently, also the numbers don't make sense. It was taken, Ramadi is, if you saw any pictures, the city basically was destroyed. Was destroyed to weed out around 400, somewhere between 400 and 500 IS militants who were struggling inside. But if you looked at the manpower ratio, again, 20 soldiers attacking to one IS fighter defending. In some areas like, for example, Raqqa, when they controlled it, they were about 12 to 1. One attacking against 12 who were more or less decentralized anti-Assad groups and fighters in Raqqa, and it was taken from them, but they were also outnumbered IS in that sense. In places like Sinai, for example, the manpower issues are just ridiculous. You know, you had 100 to 1 sometimes in some of the battles. The famous case was that of in Sheikh Zwaid town in the northeast in June 2015, where you had about 1 IS to over 100 soldier and officer. So also the numbers don't make a lot of sense. So the question is, so what's going on here? So basically, if you looked at the studies of insurgency, well, I specialize in insurgency, studied them in about 4 continents. So you go back to your roots if you wish. If you want to, if you're struggling to understand something, you go back to your areas, the areas where you understand. There's some significant data in terms of that there is a rise in the capacities and the abilities of non-state actors to beat state actors. And there was, I think, a study by Yale University where they looked at 286 insurgencies between the 1800s and 2005, and they found that in the first quarter of the 1800s, from 1800 to 1825, the state, in 90% of the cases, whoever controls the state won or beated the non-state actor. If you looked from 1976 onwards to 2005, that pattern changed. The actual capacity of the state to completely defeat insurgencies is about 25%. So a drop from 90% to 25%. And there are many try to explain why is this happening. So you have the military studies that link it to population support. So the idea that you have the Mao's old idea that the insurgents need to become like fish in water among the population. So they get the popular support in terms of logistics, in terms of recruitment, in terms of attempting to hide within the population. And this what really is the main drive behind their capacity to beat unpopular state soldiers. If you looked at the case of IS, this does not really explain what's happening. Not just talking about the thousands, the tens of thousands fleeing their areas and trying to go anywhere but under their control. But if you looked at the very few polls that was done in areas where IS controls, the most recent one is from Mosul, where a group of Iraqi researchers, it's a minor sample, so we need to take the statistics, very cautiously. But they found out that in June 2014, the support for IS in terms of, the question was as follows: is your interests aligned with IS? Is your interests or your ideas aligned with IS? That was the question. So the ones who answered yes were about 10% of the sample. That was repeated again in August of 2015 after the airstrikes, almost a year after the airstrikes, and you had around 39% saying yes. So our interests or the ideas are aligned with IS, or IS represent either our interests or our ideas. Mind you that within this sample you will find, for example, the truck driver who is basically driving oil trucks. IS sell oil under the market price, and therefore for a truck driver who's driving these oil trucks, this is a major bonanza, economic bonanza. So this guy, his interests is aligned, of course, with IS. So this person would enter into the 10% or the 39%. But it means that it's always a minority. If you looked at other areas, this minority perceive IS as an evil, but a lesser evil than the evil for some of the regimes ruling in the region, or the evil of the coalition's airstrike, or some other evil that they believe is there, and the dealing with IS is a lesser evil. This is not a popular support that Mao was talking about, Mao or Guevara or some other insurgent theorists were talking about. So then you have the military studies that talk to you about geography, the complex geography, the mountains, the jungles, basically the idea of manipulating the geography and the topography to pull up a military upset, you being the weaker side. That also does not fit the IS model. Most of the areas that they control are flat areas. No jungles, no mountains, nothing like the mountains in the Hindu Kush, the mountains in Afghanistan, or the mountains of Cuba, the mountains and jungles of Cuba, or the situation in south of Chechnya. All of this does not apply to most of the areas that they are in control of. Aside from the urban territory, but we'll come to that a bit in a second. And then you have the idea of external support, that the insurgents usually pull an upset if there is significant external state support to the weaker side, and then they will be able to win in that fashion. And there was a study as well by RAND Corporation where they studied around 89 insurgencies, and they saw that if there is external support, the ability to win among insurgents is over 60%. If the external support was withdrawn, the ability to win is about 25%. So if you get external support, it significantly alter your chances to beat the state forces. In the case of IS, despite the very widespread conspiracy theories, basically each side accused the other of being behind IS. So the Bashar regime, accused Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia accuses Iran. Iran accuses Turkey, and so on and so forth. In a sense, IS is an independent actor. The idea that it is supported by a state so far has not been proven. The idea that they have a similar support to, let's say, the Afghan Mujahideen back in the days by Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, or the Cuban rebels by the Soviet Union, that idea is not very, there is no basically a similar support from a state or a group of states. They play on the conflicting policies of states. They are good at manipulating that. But aside from that, there is not much external support. Basically, they fought against almost everyone at one point or another, including, as I said, the groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda, all the way to Kurdish forces represented by the YPJ, for example, in the north of Syria. They fought against Bashar al-Assad quite significantly. They bombarded Turkey quite significantly, fought against the Iranians. If the Saudis came in Syria at any point, they would fight against them, blew up mosques in Saudi Arabia. So in a sense, they are at war with most of the regional players at one point or another. So the idea of external support is not there. So then I started looking a bit in a sense in how do they fight basically, and to try to understand how do they pull these upsets. So looking a bit at the military strategy. The IS, basically the military strategy is a very long story. It's about 16 years of development. If you put the cutoff line from 1999, or almost 17 years now, from the small camp in western Afghanistan, in Herat, that was led by Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi and had some of the mainly Palestinian, Jordanian, and Kurdish members being trained there, all the way to the episodes in Iraq pre-2007, and then after that, after 2010, 2011, and what happened in these periods. That was a build-up of three types of capacities. The first capacity, which was used in the beginning, was the urban terrorism capacity. How to manufacture the IEDs, where to put the IEDs, how to use the IEDs, improvised explosive devices, how to deliver the IEDs via vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices, or VIBIDs, and how to turn them into almost an accurate artillery at one point or another. That on one side, but also a development of a conventional guerrilla tactics, if you wish, the hit-and-run tactics, how to embed yourself in an urban population, the attempts to assassinate, the attempt to use very fast, mobile, decentralized units to attack regular forces, and that capacity, that skill was honed under, the American military presence in Iraq. So under basically the best in the business. So they were able to hone this capacity, and in many ways, interestingly, the 2007 surge and then the awakening that happened in Iraq in that period more or less left the fittest. So it was in a very Darwinian sense, the fittest and the best within ISI, the Islamic State in Iraq back then, capacity was the ones who survived this wave of anti-ISI activities. And then you have the conventional military. And the conventional military tactics really were boosted after Mosul, after the attack on Mosul with around 800 to 1,000 fighters, and taking it from somewhere between 20 to 30,000 two divisions of the Iraqi army. And what these two divisions left in Mosul was quite significant. But also they had conventional military capacity before that in terms of the armored, the heavy artillery. They had that before Mosul, but again was boosted after the Mosul campaign. So the idea of combining these three types and aligning them in specific battles was extremely significant, and we can go a bit in details about that. How much time do I have? 5 minutes, okay. Excellent, thank you. So the idea of combining these three dimensions was quite significant. So if you looked at, for example, on tactical grounds, we'll go tactical, operation, and then strategy. In terms of tactical grounds, the idea of using the VBIDs, the vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices, in a way that either in an offensive capacity, you usually employ small mobile units that attack from the north, the east, and the south, and then leave, for example, the west for the retreat of the enemy forces. And what happens usually when the retreat happens, because of the very high-level firepower that is attacking from three sides, that exit is usually attacked by a line of vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices. So it would be 6 cars hitting the same spot exactly against the defending forces. When you do the opposite, these VBIDs as well are used quite significantly in defensive patterns, and this is probably what will happen in Mosul if it was stormed at one point or another. The mining of these cars, buildings, is quite significant as well in boosting their defensive capacities. Also looking at the type of soldiers, what you have is a mixed type of, or a hybrid type of soldiers. You have the guys who served in a regular army. Many of them, not just from Iraq, many would blame the Ba'athist army and the de-Ba'athification of the army, but it's not just the Iraqi army. It's coming from other places as well, including Syria, including Libya, including Egypt, including Georgia. So you have officers who served at one point in one state army or the other who joined. And those, of course, provide the conventional capacity. But also you have the insurgents who've been fighting. If you looked at their background, been fighting for about 2 decades. So accumulated significant, and these experiences, of course, are passed along to mid-ranks. But those are quite significant in a sense that they have the ability to defend a specific spot. And then after that, once they lose this spot, they are able to launch hit-and-run attacks against that spot to recapture it back. And how did they get this experience? Because that was the method, for example, in places like Chechnya and in places like Afghanistan. You controlled the territory, and then you lost it for a conventional army, and then you're trying to capture it back again in these two theaters. And then you have the new recruits, and mainly the foreign fighters who are choosing to joining you, traveling away from faraway areas and choosing to join IS. And those are quite useful in two senses. In one sense, the self-sacrifice is very high. So the idea of using them as suicide bombers has been quite significant in that sense. But also the idea of using them as, training them and using them as commandos in Ghamasiyin, or people who get, Ghamasiyin in Arabic, it's the people who get dipped, basically. And when you dip something, you don't pick it up. So in a sense that they will fight till the end. And significant elements of these Inghamassiyin units or suicide commando units are from this category of the foreign fighters. In terms of the strategic command, IS employs a very interesting idea, which is new, I think, to Arab armies. The strategy is centralized. So in a sense that the big picture is laid out by the military council, which is they're the highest commanding body in the organization. But then in terms of there is tactical and operational capacities, it's quite decentralized. So the local units can take charge if it's about using a specific tactic or it's about an operation that is launched against a village or a small town. You can decentralize the command on that level, which is, if you looked at how the Arab armies function, they don't function that way. The centralization is very high from up to down. This level of centralization facilitates the mobility of the organization, facilitates the decision-making of the organization, and somehow pulls upsets in situations where they are outnumbered. Sometimes they lose because of that, make no mistake. So sometimes you would find them attacking a town that one, strategically insignificant, two, they don't have the right capacity to take it over. So they lose. But somehow this also, despite that loss, it trains their mid-ranks in a way that this mistake has been done, it won't be repeated again. And this is when you get some directives from the high levels. Some of these elements are employed in the 4 countries that I focused on. Maybe we can talk about it more in the Q&A period, mainly in Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Egypt. But also, what we would like to briefly mention something about the counter strategies. So far, the counter strategies, what are we doing about this? We're doing 4 things, or 4 pillars, basically. The airstrikes, which did degrade and did kill significant numbers and did some damage to the conventional capacity of the organization. The second is the ground partners, and this is when the strategy falters. In 2007, you needed 150,000 US troops to make the surge and to defeat a much weaker organization compared to the current organization, to defeat ISI, the Islamic State in Iraq, much weaker organization compared to IS today. Plus the surge, plus the awakening councils, which were a rebellion against IS. You don't have this environment exactly now. You have something similar, but not exactly the same. But also the partners means that the brutalities that fostered the environment that brought IS in the end, Bashar al-Assad maybe, or you have calls about cooperating with Bashar al-Assad as a partner as well. So now cooperating with a brutal dictator who did what he did to Syria and the outcome of that, this is when the partners started to falter. And what this will do with the rest of the Sunni population of Iraq, of Syria, and how will that impact the rest of the region in terms of Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and others, this has a big question mark. So this is when we have where a real crisis is there. Third pillar has to do with the counter-narrative and counter-ideology, to foster basically a counter-narrative and a counter-ideology. And I worked with the UN senior consultant before 2010 on the issue of counter-narratives and de-radicalization. And one conclusion almost all of the experts in the panels reached, that the counter-narrative is interesting. It can have some significant damage to these organizations, but it will never work unless you have the right political environment. And if there is a political environment where bullets are the major method to attain political power, then you can preach whatever counter-narrative you want to preach, but the younger generation will not accept it. It will be always rejected and mocked at one point or another. And finally, the issue of political environment in terms of, and this is the hardest bit really. I think tactically, IS could be defeated. Strategically, we have a bigger problem because the political environment that re-engendered it after 2011 is still there. It was defeated before and it was reproduced. So if the situation keeps to be as it is in terms of Iraq, Syria, in terms of major level of repression, major use of religion and arms to become the only way to attain and remain in political power, marginalization of all other methods, including votes, constitutions, good governance, so on and so forth, then we're likely either to see IS continues or to see something even more worse coming out of this environment. IS was the worst version of Al-Qaeda. So actually Al-Qaeda now looks not as bad as that organization. So I'm going to stop here and we'll open the floor for discussion.
Okay, thank you, Omar. Bien, Pedro, vamos contigo y pues más o menos unos 15 minutos.
Well, some months ago, some 50 analysts of the Central Command of the United States signed a manifesto, and they complained that most of the reports that were passed on to the public opinion on the progress that was being made in the fight against the Islamic State were simply too optimistic. And that is really the reality. And what I'm trying to say, by way of introduction, I think that this is a really good conference. And the title of this conference is very good too, because I don't think we've ever really dealt with this subject in great detail. So thank you, Karim. Thank you to Casa Árabe. You've given us a very good introduction. And I believe that there are too many sort of common points as to the Islamic State. The reality in the field is information that we only reach from only reaches us from one direction. We know very little as to what is actually happening within the country, especially that area controlled by the Islamic State. And we must understand that they have over 8 million people under their control. And we need to highlight that these 8,000 or 8 million people are not against the Islamic State. They probably live better under the Islamic State rather than the Maliki state or the al-Assad state in Syria. So basically, what I'm trying to say, to put an end tactically to the militia of the Islamic forces is probably quite simple, but to close off and to completely eliminate strategically the Islamic State, I think is practically impossible, because what would basically happen is that another organization with a different name would try to resolve a series of problems that exist in these two countries and have existed for generations. And that are the roots, those are the roots of this Islamic State. So you've said, it has been said, that there's no real proof that any country has supported the Islamic State. Well, okay, if we think about open, clear, determined support, in the case of Russia, for instance, supporting the al-Assad state, or the United States supporting the al-Abadi government in Iraq, well, obviously, it is not as clear as that, but that there is no proof of open support doesn't really mean that there may have been passive support, connivance, if you like, so that the Islamic State was born, was developed and expanded the way it has. Because that is absolutely impossible to ignore. Many institutions have analyzed a large number of conflicts, and the fact that a group can actually reach this level, it must have received support of the population on the one hand, and I think that is the case, but also it must have received support from abroad. Now, when we talk about this support, well, no effort has really been made to prevent foreign fighters from reaching the regions. And I'm not really talking about the Europeans, because the Europeans are really a minority within the foreign combatants, within the Islamic State. But I'm talking about those that come from the surrounding countries. Those countries, or no countries, have actually made any effort to prevent hundreds of vehicles reaching these regions, the white pickups, the Toyotas that come from countries, the region, the fact of buying weapons which they bought from other countries, especially to take Mosul, and they've done this especially with the help of all those arms smugglers that have existed for so many centuries, and it hasn't prevented them from selling oil and refined petrol or even antiquities. I mean, all of this, they must have received support for that, because if not, the Islamic State wouldn't be what it is today. The Islamic State has also been a toy in the hand of many states, of many organizations, because it has been convenient to them, too. Their existence has been convenient to them. And if it wasn't convenient, well, they've certainly been able to take advantage of this, because basically in this conflict in Iraq and in Syria, what we see are basically all the polemological factors which we could possibly think of. For instance, ideological confrontations, religious confrontations, geopolitical confrontations, geostrategic confrontations. So this has been a toy in the hand of so many of these interests. Now, there's something else which I think we need to highlight when we talk about the survival, the military survival of this Islamic State, because it has actually shown for the very first time. I'm actually, I tend to speak really fast, but I'm talking a little slower in order to make it easier for the interpreters to do their job properly. So let us not look at this as Europeans or Spaniards. Let us look at this as through the eyes of those living in the world, especially in the Arab world. And for the very first time, they are seeing that there is an Arab force that is winning. When in the wars against Israel, for instance, it has never been they haven't been sufficiently efficient to fight the Israeli soldiers. So they're being attacked by the most powerful allies that exist in the world. The first attack under the leadership of the United States, with more than 60 countries in this partnership, with few soldiers, mind you, and then a coalition, Russia attacking them from another angle, France, and now the Belgians as well. They're all doing their bit, and they're still resisting. So for many countries, for many people, particularly in the Arab world, this is perceived as an heroic act. It is the very first time in the history, in the recent history, that is, that an Arab force is capable to face up successfully to this world, which they understand is really humiliating the Arab world, the Muslim world, and has kept them sort of separate from the rest of the international community. So what it has also proven, and when you talk about the death of the leaders, of the Al-Qaeda leaders, well, they've been killing sort of people, second and thirdly ranked leaders in Al-Qaeda all over the world, and that doesn't really mean anything. That's good propaganda, if you like, to encourage the Western populations and telling us that we're winning this war, but they're being replaced by people who are just as valid. Because basically, what we need to look at those governing the Islamic State are being really, really masterful, both strategically, as far as logistics are concerned, in war economy, and everything. They're being very masterful. They're being very adaptable. They're very flexible. And they have a doctrine which changes, which adapts depending on how they're being attacked. Let me just give you one figure. Over the last 9 months, since September 2015, In 9 months, the number of suicide attacks in Syria and Iraq have been multiplied by 4. So it's true that they are under pressure. They've lost some territory, but not that much. What they've done is adjusting to this fight, and they're going to be reacting the way they can, which they've been doing ever since 2003, through symmetry, an asymmetric war using terrorists. And they're going to be attacking all of those which they consider are their enemies, and they're going to do this wherever they can. So if it's this scenario, it'll be there, but if not in Europe, and if Europe is completely locked off, well, they'll still be attacking Western interests or Europeans wherever they can. They will still attack whoever attacks them, because that is the way in which they try to survive as a state, which is their purpose at the end of the day. A state which I think is working better than a lot of failed states that exist in this world, because it offers services to the citizens, it gives education, health, even the collection of garbage, buses, they have their own coin, they have their own army, and it's a very well-organized army, very well-structured army, because as I say, the people that are directing this Islamic State are extremely masterful. They're very, very good leaders. Now, this doesn't mean that they're fanaticists, that they're not fanaticists themselves and use fanaticists. If you get fanaticists and to fight for you, well, that's the ideal soldier. If they're prepared to die without asking any questions, simply knowing that they've got a mission to fulfill, they will be very happy to die, because basically they will be from being from zero to hero, as you may say. So they can be turned into a hero, both the person involved and their family. But as I said before, even though they may be fanaticists, this has never meant that they're not intelligent or not capable. And it is also true that intelligence and capability as such excludes fanaticism as such, both in religious groups or in military groups. So basically, if we talk about airstrikes, we've talked about airstrikes, the number of airstrikes. They're not all air attacks as such because of lack of intelligence or not a clear target. They don't decide to drop the bombs or use their weapons. But they haven't really been as efficient as one would have expected, despite the incredible economic cost. And why is this so? Well, basically, because the Islamic State, again, has adjusted to these air attacks, airstrikes, dividing themselves into small mobile units. And sometimes, even if they go to a place to fight, they go in civilian buses, and it's very difficult to know who they are. This has happened in Kosovo. Somebody in a plane, in a fighter plane, it's impossible to know whether this is a bus full of civilians or if it is a bus full of soldiers going to a particular battleground. So there's not enough on-the-ground information, because it is extremely difficult. These are desert areas. These are areas where it's very difficult to hide. There is no vegetation. There's no intelligence, therefore. And therefore, you don't have anyone who can tell you what you need to strike. Remember the story which was written by Russia, the Palmyra operation, the Russian Rambo, the special Russian forces, who for many days was pretty close to Palmyra and actually lighting up some of the targets, but the area of Palmyra is mountainous compared to the rest of this scenario, both in Iraq and Syria. These are especially along the rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris River. The riverbeds are flat, so apart from all of this, we must also understand that for an air force or for an airstrike to be operational, and it never has really been, you need good forces on the ground, really. You need good forces on the ground, and I've talked about the Taliban before. In Afghanistan, it was true that you had a very well-prepared force on the ground, supported by the special forces of the United States. This was the Northern Alliance. But in the specific case of Iraq, we haven't really been able to perceive that the Iraqi army is sufficiently efficient. We've been told that in some cases the difference in the number of forces of the Iraqi army and the Islamist State is 1 to 20 or 20 to 1. And that is an incredible figure. So look at the Iraqi army and its efficiency. When hostilities start, when Mosul is taken in 2014, the Iraqi army is a complete corrupt army where many units simply didn't exist, only on paper, where they'd sold all their armament and all their weapons, and it was just really good business to take advantage of international support, especially money received through the United States. So this brings us to a further point, which is the situation which we may not be familiar with at the moment, the internal politics in Iraq at the moment. A country which is basically about to collapse, al-Abadi regime. Remember that Maliki, who was accused by everyone for the bad management which led to this situation since 2003. He's still vice president, mind you. He hasn't left politics. This is a country which basically all analysts believe that this is now in the hands of Iran, the Shiite militias. And we know that the United States is going to be sending 200 men. Well, that's nothing. And then some Apache helicopters, which you can't probably use because the Islamic State has weapons to fight against these, the Mampa weapons, which they can actually shoot at these helicopters. So basically, Iran has controlled Iraq. And this really means that at the end of the day, they're going to be getting rid of all of the United States presidents. And that is going to be good for the Islamic State, because there are many circumstances that come into play here to understand the situation. To see whether the airstrikes have been efficient. What they've done is they've dug a lot of trenches, tunnels, or even underground oil pipes, so that where they exploit the oil, they take it to mobile refineries, oil refineries, and if they're destroyed, they can be replaced within 24 hours at a very low cost. Because once again, as I say, you know, they're very masterful, very skilled. It's got nothing to do with the Taliban regime. Remember where the Taliban came from. They were just ignorant people coming from those madrasas that had been built well, very often through money paid by countries from the Persian Gulf, and then the different Pashtun tribes that existed on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. These were students studying the Quran. They were not combatants. They didn't have any experience, and they didn't really have a structure or an organization, which the Islamic State does have. All of it created by people who were former militaries and by people, opponents of the Baas government and the Saddam Hussein government. They've actually been able to adapt their conventional strategies and techniques used by this army. And sometimes some of their soldiers and their, even their intelligence have been trained in Europe or in Western countries, and they've been able to apply their conventional ways of attacking and adapted them to the situation on the ground. Now let us look at the number of combatants, and let us see who is a combatant in this case. Let us first of all draw a distinction between somebody who's a professional, somebody who fights 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and those who are simply there for specific operations in different provinces where the caliphate exists. There are 12 provinces, and each province has its own army, which only fights, and this is again divided into 7 branches, and they only fight in their area. So these are people that are protecting their own interests, their home, their family, their land, and they are familiar with the land. And that, of course, is also important to understand the efficacy of all these units. So all these soldiers are not fighting permanently. It is only once it is necessary, when a particular operation needs to be carried out or when they need to defend what is theirs. So understand this too. The Iraqi soldiers don't have that because the Baghdad army, which is basically a Shiite army, is not going to be defending a land that is theirs. It's not the same attitude. You don't have the same aspirations in that case. So these foreign combatants, the number of foreign soldiers is really very, very small. It's a fraction. We're giving this such a lot of importance because certain Europeans have actually gone there. When some people tell me that that it's a big problem, the Islamic State is such a big problem, and I said, well, if the only security problem we had was only 200 people who've gone to fight in Iraq and Syria, and we may estimate some 20 have come back, and we actually know their size of their shoes, actually, and so that is not a problem for Europe. It's not going to get Europe to bow its head necessarily. But Karim has already said this at the beginning. There may be some 30,000 foreign fighters in Iraq and some 50,000 in Syria. These are Sunnis. And we could explain why they're fighting in Syria and why these Sunnis are fighting in Iraq and who are they fighting against and why. And why can't we close this whole chapter soon? Now, the number of combatants, some 80, 90,000 in total. Maybe some 5,000 of these are foreigners, and maybe some, maybe 15 to 18,000 foreigners have gone to Syria. Some are frustrated, some are annoyed, and they've all gone back to their respective countries. But from these combatants that have been on these scenarios, we must understand that they are generally people from the area, from the region. These are not Europeans. Well, perhaps there may have been some 5,000 Europeans that have actually gone to fight. But as I have said before, most of these are people from Jordan, from Saudi Arabia, Tunisians, Moroccans, also from Kosovo, from Bosnia, possibly some Russians, from the Caucasus, but particularly those that are really fighting are Syrians, are Iraqis, and they're people from the region. So the most recent intelligence estimates calculate that the percentage of people fighting in Syria that are actually Syrians is about 70%. But in Iraq, it's 90%. They don't need the foreign fighters because what they have enough of is the breeding ground for the development of further soldiers if they need them. So let us understand this Islamic State comes from. Where does it come from? And this popular support. It is basically because of the Sunnis who've been driven into a corner, who've been punished both in Iraq ever since 2003, when the Shiites actually take over and completely exclude the Sunnis from the government and from society at large, and they don't get any of the advantages of the money obtained through the selling of oil. So what would you do? You know, the people, the intelligence services, the soldiers, the civil servants, you know, they're being sent home, no money, but they do have the weapons. So what would you do? What would you do? You would go and join the insurgents. Well, you need to feed your family because at the end of the day, when the conflict starts in 2013, 2014 in Iraq, 70% of the youth, of Sunni youth, was unemployed. So when an Islamic State organization comes, which is in Syria, and says, "Look, you're going to be getting your privileges back. You're going to get your rights. You will be getting the money that we gain from selling oil. We won't put you in jail. We won't torture you. We won't force you to go to jail if you're demonstrating in Khalija, for instance. You know, that is no longer going to happen." So what would you do? What would your children do? Well, you'd obviously join this militia. And if you then go to Syria, well, it's exactly the same. Hatred between major communities already existed. Let us remember a detail, a specific fact. The massacre of Haman in '82, the Muslim Brotherhood promoted this. Sunnis are demonstrating to get economic advantages, and they're crushed by the father of al-Assad, and some 40,000 Sunnis were killed. You don't forget that. You don't forget that when you're in a region or on a scenario where hatred and the revenge, the feeling of revenge is so strong. So really, this is one thing we need to understand. If one day we really believe that there will be a possibility of putting an end to this conflict, and it's certainly not going to be solved through military forces. So, well, I would like to give you some time so that you can ask me some questions, most certainly. But when we talk about suicide bombers, it's true that they're being used a lot, not only for terrorist attacks, but also, and this is very important, in combination with conventional operations. So what they do at the moment is they start up a particular attack through the use of suicide bombers, and then you get these special forces, soldiers who are very experienced, coming from battlefields such as the battlefields in Chechnya, or people who have been fighting in Iraq, and they then attack those main points, main targets. And there are strategic targets, and that is when you start up these different waves of conventional forces. So, contrary to what has been done by these organizations, first they use the fanatics, and then they take those who are not so fanatic yet, so that the first wave can be a kind of example, and it gives them sort of a boost to continue fighting. So they're being really skilled. So basically, they never start a conflict. The Islamic State left Ramadi because they did not want to fight. They knew that that could have been their death. They didn't need it. Well, it's part of their territory anyway, because the people of Ramadi were part. Remember the post-conflict in Iraq? That was what was called the Sunni Triangle, together with Fallujah and Samarra. They would recover that. They know that they'll recover that because most of the people living in this city are supporters. Even Mosul. If it was so easy to take over Mosul, it was basically because of the support of the people of Mosul. I mean, they were there. They weren't against the Islamic State. So what is the Islamic State focusing on at the moment? And what is something that they're not going to give up? Raqqa in Syria, and if you follow the river basin of the Euphrates River right to the border with Iraq. Why? Because Raqqa, which you can't really attack through airstrikes, as you used to do in the Second World War, the way the cities were bombed, you can't take Raqqa because you're talking about over 1 million citizens. And if a lot of civilians die, that is going to be the best propaganda for the Islamic State in order to do what they haven't achieved up till now, which is for global jihad. and they haven't achieved this yet. But you know, countries such as Indonesia, where you have some 200 million inhabitants, there's hardly any Indonesians that have gone to Iraq and Syria. But if tomorrow the Western world would make a serious mistake to indiscriminately kill civilians, well, then they might achieve what the Islamic State has not achieved as yet. And that is where they're focusing on, because Raqqa was not declared the capital just by coincidence. It was declared for economic reasons, because of the control of water and the most important areas for crops, wheat, and also for an ideological reason. Because remember, in 657, there's a Sisin battle, where you get the schism between the Sunnis and the Shiites. And what they really want to do is they want to control this, ideologically and psychologically speaking. I don't know if I've got any more time for anything else, but anyway, thank you.
Muchas gracias a Pedro Baños y a Omar Ashour por la exposición.
Thank you, Omar, for that presentation, because that has really shown us the very sophisticated strategies that the Islamic State actually has, and also the reasons. And there are many reasons behind this, the incentives that they have, the incentives that the combatants have. And as Pedro said, it's only a minority, really, of foreign combatants when faced with the possibility of recruiting locally both Syrians, Iraqis, and others. So anyway, I think we could continue this discussion, but perhaps it would be interesting to give you the floor and see whether you would like to ask any questions.
Muchas gracias a Omar Ashour, a Pedro Baños,
to Pedro Baños for being here, and to all of you, of course, for being here, and thank you. We record most of these conferences, and you can actually listen to the YouTube channel if you're interested, or if you want to recommend them to anyone. And anyway, I do understand that it is a very complex subject indeed, complex not only in the face of Daesh, but also the regional and individual community situation, how all of this really, there are many, many details, doubtlessly, but the fact that, as Omar said, that authoritarian regimes are coming back with force, well, that is obviously going to lead to a reaction. So jihadist movements are also going to be breeding ground for the rest of the world. So this means that there is a great deal of fragmentation in all these countries. Quite recently, here in Casa Árabe, we had Scott Adram. He's a researcher, and he works on the reasons or the incentives behind young terrorists or young jihadists. And it was shown that up till now, there was no real competence. There's no real ideology that could replace the Islamist ideology. And he talks about the Kurds, for instance, briefly. Perhaps that's the only group. So they have no rivals, really, Daesh. Maybe the Kurds. The Kurds, they give you this feeling of belonging, and they may face up to the jihadists of Daesh. But basically, they are not as popular, so to speak. And the call of the wild is to go with their mates. And it's a way of surviving, and it's possibly even cool to belong to this type of movements. So this is quite a paradox. The reason why a lot of these young people actually join the ISIS is because they haven't really got much back home to look forward to somehow. So thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to your questions. Thank you to the interpreters, and see you next time. Thank you.